It was 2:48 in the morning on May 24, 1941. The icy winds of the Denmark Strait howled across the deck of a British warship. As a young naval officer scanned the horizon, through his binoculars, what he saw made his blood run cold. Out of the gray mist emerged a massive shape, a warship so large it seemed to darken the sea itself. The officer froze for a moment, unable to believe what he was seeing. There was no mistaking that silhouette. The Bismarck had arrived. The Bismarck was not just another battleship. It was a floating fortress, 50,000 tons of German steel, bristling with guns and armor. Its very existence was a declaration of Nazi ambition, designed for one purpose: to cut off Britain's lifeline across the Atlantic. It threatened to starve an entire nation into submission. Every convoy carrying food, weapons, and fuel to the British Isles was now in danger. If the Bismarck succeeded, Britain could fall, and the war in Europe might end in German victory. The clock was ticking. Somewhere out on that endless stretch of cold gray ocean, a single ship had the power to change the course of history. To the Royal Navy, the mission was clear: find the Bismarck and destroy it, no matter the cost. But finding one ship in 3 million square miles of ocean would be like hunting a ghost. The officer lowered his binoculars and called out the report. On the British ships nearby, alarms sounded. Men scrambled to battle stations. The sea that had been quiet moments before erupted with motion, searchlights flickering, engines roaring to life, gunners loading their weapons. The Royal Navy had finally made contact with its most dangerous enemy. Yet even as the British prepared for battle, few understood the scale of what they were facing. The Bismarck was more than a war machine. It was the culmination of Adolf Hitler's obsession, his dream of building the ultimate battleship, a symbol of power and defiance. Before the sun rose, that dream would become a nightmare for both sides. The most feared ship in the world had entered the fight. And in 6 minutes it would shatter Britain's pride forever. To understand the terror that Britain felt that morning, we have to go back to the moment the Bismarck was conceived, in Adolf Hitler's mind. It was 1936, and Germany was rising from the ashes of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped it of its navy, forbidding the construction of large warships. But Hitler had no intention of obeying those terms. To him, battleships weren't just tools of war. They were symbols of prestige, power, and national pride. He wanted a ship so advanced, so fearsome, that it would make the rest of the world's fleets look obsolete the moment it touched water. He summoned his top naval architects and issued a single, uncompromising command: build the ultimate battleship. The result was the Bismarck, an 823-foot-long steel leviathan weighing over 50,000 tons fully loaded. It was almost as long as the Eiffel Tower laid on its side and could move at 30 knots, faster than any British battleship afloat. Its armor was 13 inches thick along the sides and nearly 15 inches around the main turrets. Its 8 15-inch guns could hurl a shell weighing nearly a ton across more than 20 miles, capable of piercing any armor that existed at the time. The ship carried over 90 anti-aircraft guns, dozens of smaller cannons, and a radar system that was years ahead of its British counterparts. But the Bismarck was more than just a weapon. It was a floating city. Deep within its hull were luxuries that few soldiers on land would ever experience. A bakery that produced fresh bread daily, a barber shop, medical and dental clinics, an air-conditioned command room, and even a small movie theater. Every inch of the ship was designed to showcase the technological might of Nazi Germany. When the Bismarck was launched from the Blohm & Voss shipyard in Hamburg on February 14, 1939, it was not merely a naval event. It was a spectacle of propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, called it the pride of Germany. The ship's commissioning was broadcast on national radio, and the crowd that gathered cheered as if watching the rebirth of the empire itself. For the 2,200 men who would later serve aboard her, the Bismarck represented more than a posting. It was destiny. Sailors from across Germany fought for a place on its crew, believing they would be serving on an invincible fortress that no enemy could touch. The mood was one of confidence, almost arrogance. But among the officers, one man remained cautious: Captain Ernst Lindemann. A veteran sailor and a realist, Lindemann knew that no ship, no matter how mighty, could win a war alone. He privately told his officers, We will either return as heroes or not at all. And he had good reason to worry. For all of its power, the Bismarck carried one fatal weakness and isolation. Germany's navy, the Kriegsmarine, was small compared to Britain's vast Royal Navy. While the Germans had only a handful of major warships, Britain could field dozens of battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers across the Atlantic. If the Bismarck ever faced the Royal Navy head-on, it would be hopelessly outnumbered. It was built to hunt and destroy, but not to survive being hunted. Still, in the late 1930s, no one dared to imagine its doom. As the Bismarck completed its sea trials, Nazi officials watched it glide through the water with near-silent grace, its gray hull slicing through the waves. To them, this was the future, a weapon that could challenge the British Empire itself. By the time war erupted in 1939, the Bismarck stood ready, gleaming, menacing, and waiting for orders. The world's most powerful battleship had been born, and soon, it would leave harbor for its first and only mission, one that would make it legendary, and seal its fate forever. By the spring of 1941, Europe was burning. France had fallen, Norway was occupied, and Britain stood alone, its survival depending on the convoys that crossed the Atlantic, bringing food, oil, and weapons from America. Every ship that made that journey was a lifeline. Every ship that didn't brought Britain one step closer to starvation. In Berlin, Hitler demanded a decisive strike to cut that lifeline once and for all. The order was given. The Bismarck would break out into the Atlantic and destroy as many Allied merchant convoys as possible. The mission was codenamed Operation Rheinübung, Exercise Rhine, but there would be nothing routine about it. On May 18, 1941, under gray northern skies, the Bismarck slipped quietly out of the port of Gotenhofen, today's Gdynia, Poland. Escorting her was the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, a powerful ship in its own right, but clearly the junior partner in this mission. As the massive battleship moved through the Baltic, sailors lined the decks in silence. They knew they were embarking on a dangerous journey, one from which they might never return. The mission was simple on paper: break through the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland, enter the open Atlantic, and begin hunting the convoys. But British intelligence was already watching. Thanks to reconnaissance aircraft and Norwegian spies, the Royal Navy knew the Germans were preparing something big. The warning that reached London was brief but chilling. Bismarck is out. When Winston Churchill received that message, he reportedly went pale. He knew what the Bismarck could do. If it reached the convoy routes, it could sink 50 merchant ships before being cornered. Britain, already struggling under rationing, could collapse in weeks. Immediately, the Royal Navy went into motion. Churchill's orders were direct and uncompromising: sink the Bismarck. Within hours, nearly every major warship in the North Atlantic was converging on the Denmark Strait. The aircraft carrier Victorious, the battleships King George V and Prince of Wales, the battle cruiser Hood, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers were all dispatched. It was the largest naval hunt in history, a desperate race against time across a gray and stormy sea. Meanwhile, aboard the Bismarck, Captain Ernst Lindemann and Admiral Günther Lütjens reviewed their plan. The Prince Eugen would scout ahead while the Bismarck remained slightly behind, using its superior firepower to crush any opposition. The crew was confident. Their ship was new, powerful, and equipped with state-of-the-art radar. Many believed that nothing afloat could challenge them. But even before reaching the open ocean, trouble was brewing. A mechanical issue delayed the refueling support ships that were supposed to meet the Bismarck after it entered the Atlantic. That meant fuel would be critical. Any damage to the fuel system could be catastrophic. Lindemann, cautious as ever, urged care. But Admiral Lütjens was under pressure from Berlin to strike fast and show results. The Reich wanted a victory to boost morale, and retreat was not an option. As the German ships neared the Denmark Strait, fog and sleet closed in. It was the perfect cover, but also a dangerous one. British patrols could be anywhere, hidden beyond the horizon. Radar pings echoed across the bridge, and every officer was tense. Somewhere in that vast expanse of cold water, the Royal Navy was waiting. On the evening of May 23rd, British cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk made radar contact with the Bismarck. The hunt had become a chase. The Germans knew they'd been found, but it was too late to turn back. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic naval battles in history, a confrontation that would make headlines across the world and turn the pride of Germany into a legend. The Bismarck was now out in the open Atlantic, surrounded by enemies, and heading straight toward destiny. Dawn broke cold and gray over the Denmark Strait on May 24, 1941. Waves smashed against the hull of the Bismarck as it steamed westward, cutting through the frigid waters between Greenland and Iceland. On its bridge, Admiral Lutyens and Captain Lindemann stood side by side, peering through binoculars into the fog. They knew the British were coming, and soon they would find them. At 5:37 a.m., lookouts aboard the German cruiser Prince Eugen spotted shapes emerging through the mist. Two British warships, the battlecruiser HMS Hood and the new battleship HMS Prince of Wales, closing in fast. Both sides opened fire almost simultaneously, each ship turning to bring its main guns to bear. The Battle of the Denmark Strait had begun. The Hood was the pride of the Royal Navy, a legend from the days of World War I, known as the Mighty Hood. It was Britain's largest and most famous warship, a symbol of national pride that had toured the world and represented the very image of British sea power. But despite its reputation, the Hood was outdated. Its armor was thin compared to the Bismarck's new design, especially on the deck, a fatal weakness against plunging shell fire. From over 10 miles away, the Bismarck's 8 15-inch guns roared to life. Each salvo shook the ship like thunder, hurling massive shells across the gray sea. The Hood and Prince of Wales responded, firing back with equal fury. The horizon erupted in flashes of flame and smoke as water columns the size of buildings exploded around the ships. For 8 long minutes, the two sides traded fire blindly through fog and rain. Then at 5:58 a.m., the Bismarck's 5th salvo found its mark. A shell struck the Hood near its rear mast, piercing the weak deck armor and plunging deep into the aft magazine, where hundreds of tons of ammunition were stored. For one terrifying instant there was silence. Then the Hood vanished in a blinding explosion. The blast split the battlecruiser in two. Flames and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air. The shockwave rolled across the sea, and when the smoke cleared, the Hood was gone, swallowed by the Atlantic in less than 3 minutes. Of her crew of 1,018 men, only 3 survived. Aboard the Prince of Wales, sailors stood in stunned silence as wreckage and bodies drifted past. The pride of the Royal Navy had been destroyed by a single devastating shot. Admiral Lutyens remained expressionless on the Bismarck's bridge. Captain Lindemann, shaken by the sight, whispered quietly, "I had to fire. She was shooting at us." But there was no triumph, only disbelief. They had just killed 400 men in less than the time it takes to boil a pot of coffee. Yet the battle was not over. The Prince of Wales, though damaged and suffering from mechanical problems, continued to fight. It managed to land several hits on the Bismarck, one of which struck below the waterline and ruptured a fuel tank. Black oil began spilling into the sea, trailing behind the ship as it fled. The Bismarck was wounded, not fatally, but enough to alter its fate. Admiral Lutyens now faced a critical decision. The ship had lost a large portion of its fuel and could no longer continue the mission. He decided to head for the French port of Saint-Nazaire for repairs. But the British, furious and humiliated by the loss of the Hood, would never let that happen. When news of the Hood's destruction reached London, Winston Churchill's reaction was immediate and cold. The Bismarck must be destroyed. Every available ship, plane, and submarine in the Atlantic was ordered to join the hunt. What had begun as a daring German mission had now become a desperate chase, one battleship against an entire navy. The Bismarck had won the battle, but its victory had sealed its doom. The Atlantic was now a battlefield. As the last echoes of the Hood's explosion faded into the mist, the Bismarck turned south, engines roaring. Behind it stretched a long slick of oil, a deadly trail marking its path across the ocean. The ship was damaged, leaking fuel from a hit near its tanks, but still powerful enough to fight. Admiral Lutyens knew the mission was over. The plan to raid Allied shipping had failed before it even began. Now survival was the only objective. He set course for the occupied French coast nearly 1,000 miles away. If the Bismarck could reach the port of Saint-Nazaire, it would be safe under the protection of German air cover. but getting there would mean outrunning, or outsmarting, the entire British Navy. The news of the Hood's destruction hit Britain like a hammer. The Royal Navy's most beloved ship was gone, and 1,400 of its men were dead. Churchill's response was instant and absolute. "I don't care how you do it. Sink the Bismarck." From that moment, the greatest sea hunt in history began. Every available warship in the North Atlantic was ordered to converge on the German battleship's last known position. The Ark Royal and Victorious, two aircraft carriers, launched their squadrons. Battleships King George V, Rodney, and Prince of Wales set course at full speed. Cruisers shadowed the area. Even destroyers running low on fuel joined the chase. The Bismarck was alone, but not unseen. British cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk, equipped with radar, tracked it relentlessly from a distance, always staying just out of range of its guns. Their mission wasn't to fight. It was to keep eyes on the German ship until reinforcements arrived. Aboard the Bismarck, the mood was grim but defiant. The crew patched holes, pumped out seawater, and cleaned the decks still stained with oil from the earlier hit. Captain Lindemann remained calm, but he knew they were being hunted. Every few hours he changed course in an attempt to shake off the British cruisers. Each maneuver bought them time, but not much. On May 24th, as night fell, the first British counterattack came. Aircraft from the carrier Victorious found the Bismarck in the dark and launched a torpedo strike. 9 outdated Swordfish biplanes, slow, vulnerable, and nearly obsolete, dove through heavy anti-aircraft fire. Against all odds, one torpedo struck the battleship's side. It caused minor damage, but the psychological impact was immense. The hunters had found their prey. Lütjens radioed Berlin to report the situation. His message was confident, but those who heard it noticed something else. A tone of fatalism beneath his calm words. He knew the British would not stop until his ship was gone. The next day, a stroke of luck briefly favored the Germans. Through a clever course change under cover of fog, the Bismarck slipped away. When the British radar screens went blank, panic erupted. For 30 crucial hours, the Royal Navy lost its quarry. The Bismarck vanished into the Atlantic. Search planes fanned out in all directions. Warships zigzagged across the ocean, burning precious fuel in the desperate hunt. The British Admiralty feared the worst, that the Bismarck might already be closing in on France. Then, at 10:30 p.m. on May 26th, a reconnaissance plane from the carrier Catalina spotted a dark shape moving through the waves. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "Bismarck sighted." The chase was back on. By now, the German battleship was just 400 miles from the French coast, almost within reach of safety. But between it and salvation lay the entire British home fleet, closing in fast. The next few hours would determine everything. Night was falling. The weather was worsening, and above the clouds, a squadron of ancient Swordfish biplanes was preparing to launch once again, for the attack that would change naval history forever. The storm swept over the Atlantic like a living thing, rain hammering the decks, wind screaming through the rigging. On the carrier Ark Royal, pilots of the Fleet Air Arm prepared for one of the most daring attacks of the war. Their mission was simple in words, but nearly suicidal in practice. Locate and cripple the Bismarck before it could reach the safety of France. At 7:10 p.m., 15 fragile biplanes lifted off the deck. They were Swordfish, relics of an earlier era, slow, open cockpit planes made of canvas and wire. Against the steel monster they were flying toward, they looked hopelessly outdated. But that night, those slow, awkward machines carried the fate of Britain. The weather was dreadful. Torrential rain and howling winds tossed the Swordfish like toys in the air. Waves below rose like mountains, flashes of lightning illuminating the Black Sea. Yet the pilots pressed on, navigating by instinct in the faint glow of their instruments. Somewhere out there, beneath the storm, was the most dangerous ship in the world. Suddenly, through the clouds, they saw it, the dark shape of the Bismarck rolling through the waves like a wounded beast. Its massive guns opened fire immediately, hurling shells and tracer rounds into the sky. Each explosion lit up the storm clouds, painting the night in flashes of orange and red. The British pilots dove. Torpedoes dropped into the sea, white wakes streaking toward the battleship. The Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns blazed, but the Swordfish were flying so slowly that the gunners' calculations were useless. Their shells passed harmlessly ahead. One torpedo struck near the bow. Another slammed into the armor belt. Then came the shot that changed everything. A torpedo hit the stern right near the rudder assembly. In an instant, the Bismarck shuddered violently, losing control. Its rudder was jammed hard to port. The ship began turning in circles. Aboard the Bismarck, chaos erupted. Engineers flooded the steering compartments, trying desperately to free the jammed rudder. Divers went overboard, risking their lives in the freezing Atlantic. But the damage was too severe. The Bismarck could no longer steer. Captain Lindemann immediately understood the implications. The mighty battleship, the pride of the German Navy, was now crippled, still armed, still afloat, but unable to escape. He ordered the engines to full reverse, then full ahead, trying to steer with propulsion alone, but the ship continued to spiral helplessly in wide, slow circles. The crew was silent. They all knew what it meant. The Royal Navy would come for them at dawn. Above the storm, the Swordfish pilots turned back toward their carrier. Mission accomplished. Many didn't even know what they had achieved, only that they had survived the most terrifying attack of their lives. When they landed, drenched and shaking, their commanders realized the truth. The Bismarck was doomed. Throughout the night, British destroyers closed in on the crippled battleship. They attacked from every direction, launching torpedoes and firing shells, forcing the Germans to stay awake and at their guns. The Bismarck's anti-aircraft batteries blazed into the dark, firing at shadows. Exhaustion spread through the crew. Inside the shattered hull, Captain Lindemann gathered his officers. His voice was calm, almost resigned. "We will fight to the last shell," he told them, "but we cannot win. Save yourselves when the time comes." Some men wrote final letters home, knowing they would never be delivered. Others prayed, while the engineers below kept the generators running, refusing to abandon their posts. The storm raged on as the Bismarck drifted, circling endlessly on the dark Atlantic, a giant wounded and alone. By dawn, the sea had quieted. In the pale gray light of May 27th, the lookout spotted shapes on the horizon. 2 British battleships closing fast. The hunters had arrived. And what would follow was not a battle, but an execution. At dawn on May 27th, 1941, the North Atlantic lay gray and silent. Waves rolled under a cold, colorless sky. Then out of the mist, 2 dark shapes emerged, the British battleships King George V and Rodney. They were closing in fast. Aboard the crippled Bismarck, Captain Ernst Lindemann and Admiral Günther Lutyens stood on the bridge. They had no illusions left. The rudder was still jammed. The ship could no longer steer or flee. The men knew what was coming. Lindemann gave a quiet order: prepare for battle. At 8:47 a.m., the British opened fire. The calm morning exploded into thunder. Giant 16-inch shells screamed through the air, slamming into the ocean around the German ship. Within minutes, the Bismarck returned fire, but it was already too late. The first British salvos tore into the superstructure, shredding the bridge and ripping apart the forward turrets. Fire control systems were destroyed almost immediately. The German gunners, who had once been precise and deadly, could now only fire blindly. Still they fought. Shell after shell smashed into the Bismarck, tearing open her armor, setting fires and killing hundreds. Yet the ship refused to die. Its massive armored belt, 12 inches thick, held firm below the waterline. From a distance, the British officers could hardly believe it. They had hit the ship hundreds of times, and still it stayed afloat, defiantly firing back. Inside, conditions were hellish. Smoke and fire filled every corridor. Men stumbled through darkness lit only by burning oil. The roar of explosions never stopped. The heat was unbearable. Yet in every compartment, sailors kept fighting, passing shells, manning guns, tending to the wounded. On the bridge, Admiral Lutyens remained silent, staring straight ahead. His communications had been cut, his ship shattered, but his posture never changed. He had sworn to fight to the end, and that's exactly what he was doing. By 9:30 a.m., Rodney had closed to just 4 miles, point-blank range for battleships. Every broadside it fired smashed deep into the Bismarck's hull. One shell hit the forward turrets, blowing them apart. Another ripped through the conning tower. The main guns of the Bismarck, once the pride of Nazi engineering, fell silent one by one. Still, the ship stayed afloat. Its flag continued to fly amid the smoke. The British kept firing, 2,800 shells in total. They were determined to finish it. By 10 a.m., the Bismarck was little more than a burning wreck. The superstructure was twisted steel. The deck was littered with bodies and debris. Yet the German engineers below kept the pumps running and the generators humming. They refused to abandon their ship. When the order finally came to scuttle, it was not from fear, it was from pride. The Germans would rather sink their own ship than let it be captured. Valves were opened. Explosive charges were set. Water poured into the lower decks. Captain Lindemann stood on the bridge for the last time, his uniform torn and covered in soot. Survivors later said he stood straight, saluting as his ship began to roll. He gave one final command: "Men, abandon ship. Long live Germany." At 10:39 a.m., the Bismarck rolled onto her side and began to sink. The sea swallowed her slowly, as if reluctant to let go of such a monster. Out of 2,200 men, only 114 survived. The rest went down with their ship. Admiral Lutyens was never found. As the last piece of the Bismarck disappeared beneath the waves, the guns of the Royal Navy fell silent. The most feared ship in the world was gone. The mighty battleship that had once symbolized Nazi power had met its end, not in victory, but in fire and silence on the cold Atlantic floor. The Atlantic grew quiet again after the guns fell silent. Smoke drifted away on the wind, and only the sound of the waves remained. Where once the most powerful battleship in the world had ruled the sea, now there was only oil and wreckage floating on the surface. The Royal Navy began rescuing survivors, pulling exhausted oil-soaked men from the freezing water. Many clung to debris, too weak to speak. Out of a crew of more than 2,200, just 114 were saved. Minutes later, U-boats were reported nearby, and the British ships withdrew, leaving hundreds still in the water. Most would not survive the night. For the Germans, the loss of the Bismarck was a devastating blow. It was not just a military defeat, but a psychological one. The ship that had been the pride of the Kriegsmarine, Hitler's symbol of power and technological mastery, was gone after just 8 days at sea. Its destruction marked the end of Germany's dream of surface dominance. Never again would the Reich send such a massive warship into battle. For Britain, the victory was bittersweet. The Hood had been avenged, but the cost was heavy. The chase had drained the fleet, and more than 1,000 British sailors had died in the hunt. Still, the message was clear. The Royal Navy had triumphed. The Atlantic lifeline would remain open. Britain would endure. In the decades that followed, the Bismarck became a legend, a story of brilliance and tragedy, of courage and futility. It represented both the pinnacle and the downfall of the battleship era. The world had changed. The future of naval warfare would belong not to massive guns and thick armor, but to aircraft and submarines. In 1989, explorer Robert Ballard, the same man who found the Titanic, discovered the wreck of the Bismarck 3 miles beneath the Atlantic. It lay eerily preserved, its hull still intact, its guns still pointing toward the sky. Today it rests there in silence, a monument to the men who served on both sides, and a reminder of a simple truth. No matter how powerful a weapon may be, war is always fought and lost by human hands.